At 9:30 a.m., two hooded figures crept down a moonlit dock with a gas can. 30 seconds later, a sailboat erupted into flames. A 40-year legacy turned to ash before sunrise. But that fire didn't break its owner. It ignited a chain reaction that would expose a six-figure embezzlement scheme and destroy an entire HOA board. Before we dive in, make sure you hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss a true-life HOA revenge story like this one. It helps more than you know. Sleep became optional. Garrett turned his grief into fuel, sitting at his kitchen table long after midnight with a legal pad and a stack of HOA documents spread like a crime scene. Coast Guard habits came back automatically. Gather intel, chart the currents, then move. His tiny blog, once just a way to vent, became a repository of fact. He posted the surveyor's report proving his dock was legal. He posted photographs of Linda Drayton's son's oversized truck violating the very parking rules she'd used to fine others. He didn't editorialize. He let homeowners draw their own conclusions. The trick, he knew, would be money. People hide power in paperwork, but paper always leaves a trail. He filed a public records request with the county for every contract the HOA had signed in the past 3 years. Sunshine laws were boring but powerful, and HOAs counted as quasi-public entities under North Carolina statute. After a week of back and forth with a weary clerk, a fat envelope arrived at his post office box. The first pages were routine landscaping bids, clubhouse cleaning contract. But buried deeper lay the smell of rot. A vendor called Pinnacle Community Solutions had received over $100,000 for consulting and management advisories. No website, no employees, only a Wilmington P.O. box. The registered agent, Linda Drayton's maiden name. A shell company hiding in plain sight. Garrett laid the invoices across his kitchen counter, tracing arrows from HOA funds to Pinnacle to Linda's personal account. He could almost feel the rhythm of the transfers, dues paid by hundreds of families turning into cash deposits and a new Lexus for the president who lectured everyone about standards. He posted the invoices on his blog with a simple headline, "Where Your Money Went." Shares multiplied overnight in local Facebook group. By Thursday morning, his inbox was full of screenshots, questions, and stories from neighbors who'd been fined for trivial violations while board members quietly enriched themselves. On Friday, a courier delivered a heavy envelope from a downtown law firm, a cease and desist letter threatening a defamation suit unless the blog came down within 72 hours. Garrett scanned the letter and posted it under the title, "They're threatening me for telling the truth." Coast Guard training had taught him something about legal threats. You don't panic when a wave hits. You adjust your weight and ride it out. Behind the scenes, though, he needed expertise. He called an old service buddy turned forensic accountant, sending him every contract and bank statement he'd unearthed. Within days, the accountant was sending back annotated spreadsheets and little red flags. Not just the shell company, but inflated hourly rates, illegal board stipends, and taxes underreported to the IRS. It was a pattern, and patterns are evidence. As Garrett worked, fear shifted in the neighborhood. Residents began to see the outlines of a con and started quietly reaching out. A retired paralegal offered to draft letters. A deputy sheriff who lived on the next street started dropping by with tips. The once silent community was forming a small coalition around him. Not loud, not public yet, but real. Then he discovered a clause in the HOA's own bylaws requiring annual open elections with secret ballots and 30 days' notice. The board hadn't held a legitimate election in 3 years. Instead, Linda had collected blank proxy forms door to door, filling in votes herself. Her entire board's authority was technically illegitimate. That night, Garrett sat back in his chair under buzzing fluorescent light, feeling the cold satisfaction of a current shifting in his favor. This was no longer just about a burned boat. This was about dismantling a miniature dictatorship disguised as a homeowners association. He printed 200 copies of a recall petition. He would need only 68 signatures, 20% of homeowners, to force a special election and end Linda Drayton's reign. It wouldn't be easy, people were still scared. But every dictatorship looks invincible until someone starts collecting signatures. At first, the petition felt like walking door to door with a live wire. Garrett would knock, explain the illegal proxies and shell company, then watch homeowners glance nervously over their shoulders as if Linda Drayton might be crouched in the azaleas. Some murmured support but refused to sign. Others shut doors gently but firmly. The aura of fear she had built over a decade was still strong. 14 signatures trickled in the first week, a fraction of what he needed. Garrett began to doubt his plan. But resistance rarely starts with a crowd. It starts with one person willing to stand in the open. In this case, it was Marisol Alvarez, a landscaper fined $2,000 for unapproved hedge height. She arrived on Garrett's porch one Saturday morning with a thermos of cinnamon coffee and the kind of look he recognized from rescue operations: determination in the face of risk. She had been talking quietly to dozens of Hispanic families also targeted by selective enforcement. 47 of them were ready to sign, but they needed neutral ground. Garrett agreed to meet them at her house. Within 11 days, signatures surged past the required 68. A stack of names and addresses thick as a paperback landed on the HOA's desk like a thunderclap. The part-time secretary handled it as if it were a grenade. By law, the board had to schedule a special election. Linda's reaction was immediate and telling. An emergency vote appeared on the HOA calendar, a special assessment of $80,000 for urgent clubhouse plumbing repairs, to be approved within 72 hours. Garrett walked to the clubhouse, snapped photos of pristine bathrooms, and posted them online. It was an attempt to drain the reserve fund before anyone could audit it. The more desperate she became, the more residents began to peel away. Neighbors who once avoided Garrett now slipped envelopes into his mailbox, violation notices they'd kept, screenshots of HOA emails, even audio clips from meetings. He built a timeline, a wall of evidence in his home office. Dates of fines, dates of shell company payments, dates of every retaliatory act since the dock dispute. Patterns emerged like tide charts. Meanwhile, his forensic accountant friend dug deeper, uncovering nearly $200,000 in combined embezzlement and overbilling, plus a paper trail of tax fraud. The numbers were courtroom solid. Garrett began coordinating with a retired paralegal and a sympathetic deputy sheriff. They called it Operation Clean Sweep, half-jokingly, but the name stuck. The plan expanded beyond a recall petition. They would hit the board from every angle at once: legal, financial, criminal, and public. Demand letters citing fiduciary breach would go to each board member individually, making them personally liable. Complaints would be filed with the State Attorney General's HOA Fraud Task Force. A town hall would be scheduled at the community center, open to media, to present the evidence live. Linda Drayton still had her network, her sister as treasurer, a vice president who rubber-stamped everything, and a handful of residents benefiting from her selective enforcement. But the current was shifting. She was making mistakes, burning through goodwill, and the once silent homeowners were starting to taste the possibility of change. On a gray October dawn, Garrett stood where his dock used to be, watching mist rise from the lake. Behind him, on his kitchen table, sat the demand letters ready for service. In his email drafts lay complaints to the state and IRS, waiting for a single click. This wasn't just a blog anymore. It was a full-scale operation, and once it began there would be no going back. Monday morning the gears began to turn. Certified envelopes went out to each board member individually, not as a group. The letters, drafted by the retired paralegal, spelled out in plain language their personal exposure for breach of fiduciary duty. North Carolina law was clear. If an HOA board misuses funds, each member can be held personally liable. Their homes, cars, and savings accounts were at risk if they didn't cooperate. The letters offered a single olive branch: Whoever came forward first with evidence would be recommended for leniency. Simultaneously, Garrett's friend filed the complaints with the Attorney General's HOA Fraud Task Force and the IRS. Within 48 hours, case numbers came back with assigned investigators. A parallel complaint went to the HOA's bank, attaching the invoices that traced payments into Linda Drayton's shell company. The bank's fraud department flagged the accounts and began a hold. By Wednesday, the reserve fund was effectively frozen. That afternoon, Marisol called from the clubhouse parking lot, laughing so hard she could barely speak. Linda had stormed out of an emergency meeting, screaming into her phone, her Lexus fishtailing as she sped away. Without access to funds, she couldn't pay the law firm representing the board, the grounds crew, or even the clubhouse's utility bills. Her little empire had suddenly run out of cash. Garrett didn't gloat. He'd spent too many years hauling panicked boaters out of rough water to underestimate the danger of desperation. A cornered person makes mistakes, and sometimes lashes out. He doubled his security cameras, cloud-backed every file, and stored physical copies of evidence off-site. He also began assembling a small war room at Marisol's kitchen table, the paralegal with her boxes of statutes, the deputy sheriff in uniform after hours, the forensic accountant on a laptop screen. They mapped out next moves like a tactical chart. Simultaneous legal actions, public exposure, and a town hall event 2 weeks out to reveal everything. While the task force moved, the social pressure built. Garrett reserved the community center's main hall for December 18th and sent invitations to local news outlets. Flyers went quietly door to door, inviting homeowners to an open meeting about Emerald Bay finances. On Facebook groups, the story began to take on a life of its own. Screenshots of bank transfers, memes of Linda's vanity plate, whispers of criminal charges. The image of an untouchable HOA president started to crack. But Linda wasn't finished. The same week the bank froze her accounts, a coordinated smear campaign appeared online. Fake emails from Garrett threatening violence, 1-star reviews for a non-existent Garrett's dock service, whispers that he'd burned his own boat for insurance. Neighbors who had been friendly now crossed the street to avoid him. His insurance claim was suddenly under extended investigation after an anonymous tip. Even Marisol's landscaping truck was vandalized with a slur. It felt less like winning than like being punched in the face while waiting for the referee. Yet each move Linda made dug her deeper. The bribery attempt she sent via LinkedIn to the forensic accountant, offering $25,000 to re-evaluate his findings, was screen-captured and forwarded straight to the Attorney General. It was textbook obstruction of justice, added to the case file immediately. Garrett reminded himself what his father had written inside that old Coast Guard manual: calm seas never made a skilled sailor. The water was rougher than ever, but the current was shifting in his favor. He had the facts, the law, and now the state on his side. The town hall was coming. If it went as planned, the entire neighborhood would see what had been happening behind closed doors, and Linda Drayton's reign would be over. By early December the lake had turned slate gray, the air carrying a bite that warned of winter. On the surface Emerald Bay Estates still looked neat and orderly, but underneath it was fracturing. Board members stopped answering residents' questions. The clubhouse stayed dark at night because the utility bill hadn't been paid. Notices posted on the HOA website appeared and disappeared within hours. For the first time in a decade, Linda Drayton's control was visibly slipping. Behind the scenes, the state investigation moved faster than anyone had expected. The Attorney General's task force confirmed every major piece of the financial puzzle: the shell company payments, the inflated consulting fees, the illegal stipend. They also discovered 3 years of falsified tax filings, turning a state embezzlement case into a federal tax fraud case. Subpoenas went out for Linda, her sister the treasurer, and the vice president who had rubber-stamped contracts. At the same time, the State Bureau of Investigation quietly opened an arson file. The deputy sheriff had handed over Garrett's security footage and a juvenile record showing Linda's son's prior fire-setting incidents. Agents began piecing together phone records, car movements, and bank withdrawals. The case was no longer a tragic accident at the marina. It was a criminal conspiracy. Paige, Linda's sister, cracked first. Shaken by the personal liability letters, she reached out through the paralegal and offered cooperation. In exchange for a recommendation of leniency, she handed over emails, bank records, and even secret audio recordings from closed board meetings. One email sent 2 days before the fire read, "Code the Pinnacle payments as landscaping and don't itemize. And don't worry about the boat situation, I'm handling it personally." It was the smoking gun Garrett had been waiting for. Combined with the SBI's evidence from Trey's car, a gas can matching the accelerant from the boat fire, the case was now airtight. Linda's own words linked the money and the arson. While the legal net tightened, Garrett and his small coalition focused on the social front. The town hall invitations went out to every homeowner, local press, and bloggers who covered consumer scandals. A retired IT worker volunteered to set up a live stream. Flyers appeared on bulletin boards at grocery stores and coffee shops. People who had once whispered now forwarded tips openly. In private group chats, residents talked about voting out the board, hiring independent auditors, and rewriting the bylaws. Linda tried to counterattack, but each move backfired. Her press conference at her real estate office drew only a handful of supporters and turned into a viral clip of her stammering under reporters' questions about Pinnacle Property Solutions. Her franchise quietly removed her profile from its website and issued a bland ethics statement. Hank, the vice president, contacted the AG's office through his lawyer and began handing over documents in hopes of saving himself. Garrett stayed quiet publicly. He worked his checklist like a rescue mission. Evidence backed up in 3 places, town hall presentation rehearsed, slides clean and simple. He wasn't chasing vindication anymore. He was executing a plan that would give the homeowners every fact and every document in one unavoidable dose. On the evening of December 16th, 2 days before the scheduled town hall, he walked down to the empty space where his dock used to be. The water reflected a cold orange sunset. In his mind he pictured his father's handwriting again. Calm seas never made a skilled sailor. This was the final stretch of the storm. In less than 48 hours, everything they had built, or everything they feared, would be laid bare. December 18th arrived cold and raw, the sky the color of unpolished steel. By dusk, the parking lot of the community center overflowed with cars. Homeowners bundled in coats filed through the glass doors, their voices low with curiosity and tension. Local news crews carried tripods across the sidewalk. Bloggers set up phones on ring lights. The fire marshal would have cringed at the crowd. Every seat was filled, the aisles jammed, the back wall lined with residents who had never once attended an HOA meeting but now refused to miss this. Garrett stood near the podium at the front of the hall, heart steady, Coast Guard training tamping down nerves. On the projector screen behind him was the first slide, a photograph of his father's sailboat gleaming on the water before the fire. On the front row sat the coalition, Marisol, calm but electric with anticipation, the paralegal, glasses perched low, boxes of documents at her feet, Deputy Crowley in uniform, and a laptop screen streaming the forensic accountant. A row behind them sat the Assistant Attorney General herself, taking note. At the far back corner of the hall, alone, sat Linda Drayton. Black pantsuit, hair pulled tight, face pale under heavy makeup. The crowd had left 2 empty seats on either side of her as though corruption itself were contagious. Garrett began with the boat. The before and after photos silenced the room, beauty turned to a black husk. He described the fire marshal's finding of gasoline as accelerant, the security footage of 2 hooded figures, the SBI's evidence from Trey's car. He did not name Linda. He didn't have to. Heads turned toward her anyway. Then he shifted to the money. Slide after slide showed invoices to Pinnacle Property Solutions, transfers into Linda's personal account, inflated consulting contracts, illegal stipends, falsified tax returns. The accountant's analysis displayed like tide charts. Dues flowing in, dollars disappearing out. Every figure was sourced, every document watermarked. Murmurs rose to shouts. "That's our money," someone called. "I paid for those roads," another shouted. The room tipped from curiosity to outrage, the crowd pressing forward as though the truth itself pulled them closer. Garrett explained the illegitimate elections, the proxy forms Linda had collected door to door, the lack of legal ballots, the years of unchallenged power. The paralegal read the statute aloud, her voice sharp as a gavel. Every board vote since had been void. The deputy confirmed the SBI's active arson case. The accountant walked through each fraudulent dollar. For 2 hours, evidence stacked higher and higher until it towered above the room like a wave about to break. Linda sat stiff in her chair, lips pressed white, hands trembling. When Garrett concluded with the final number, nearly $200,000 stolen, the room erupted. Some residents stood, demanding her resignation. Others shouted for her arrest. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras zoomed, phones streamed live. Garrett ended simply. "This isn't about my boat anymore. This is about every family here who trusted their dues would go to our community, not into someone's pocket. The choice is yours now. What kind of neighborhood do you want to live in?" Applause thundered, raw and uncoordinated, rolling through the hall. For the first time in months Garrett felt the weight on his chest lift, if only slightly. But even as the meeting dissolved into a life on Lake Maynard looked picture-perfect from the outside. A tranquil sheet of water rimmed with beige houses, clipped hedges, and the occasional pontoon boat gliding by. For Garrett Wilson, a retired Coast Guard rescue swimmer, it was supposed to be a final landing after decades of storms. His cabin was modest but faced the sunrise, and at the end of a narrow wooden pier sat his father's sailboat, the Morning Star. Restoring it had been his therapy, sanding away grief one plank at a time until varnish gleamed like honey. The Homeowners Association, however, was a different kind of ocean. Emerald Bay Estates billed itself as an exclusive lakeside community, with $1 million+ annual budget and bylaws thicker than a phone book. At the helm sat Linda Drayton, a platinum-haired president who never met a rule she didn't weaponize. On paper she upheld standards. In practice she punished anyone who stood in her way, issuing citations for mailbox paint chips while her own son's lifted truck rumbled across community grass with impunity. Garrett had mostly stayed off her radar until his dock became non-compliant overnight. A certified letter arrived claiming it encroached 2 feet into common waterway. His surveyor proved otherwise, but the board brushed him off. From that moment the pattern of petty retaliation began. Anonymous complaints, surprise inspections, and icy smiles at the clubhouse. Garrett sensed a bigger play behind the paper trail. The kind developers whisper about over barbecue when no one's listening. Yet summer still lulled him into thinking it was just harassment. He taught free sailing lessons to neighborhood kids, kept his truck spotless to avoid citations, and posted calm updates to a little blog he'd started to document the dispute. It drew a trickle of views, nothing more. Meanwhile Linda's board controlled dues like a private ATM, shifting money between consultants with zero homeowner oversight. Then one muggy August evening Garrett came home from visiting his daughter to find neon paint dripping down his hull. Welfare Sailor on one side, Go Home on the other. The spray was still tacky. Whoever had done it had gate access. He reported it, installed cameras, and reminded himself to breathe. Coast Guard training taught patience. You don't dive into dark water blind, you map the currents first. Unbeknownst to him, a far more dangerous strike was already being planned. And it would come not as paint but as fire. It was a night stitched out of stillness, not even a breeze on the water. The dock boards held a faint warmth from the day's heat as the lake exhaled a thin silver mist. Garrett had been asleep for barely 2 hours when training kicked him upright. Something had jarred him awake before his mind caught up. The muted thud of footsteps, the faint metallic slosh of liquid poured where liquid shouldn't be, and then, like a flare gun, the smell, gasoline, acrid and sharp, cutting through the normal lake scent of algae and wet cedar. By the time he reached the back door barefoot, the sky at the end of his pier was glowing orange. The sound that followed wasn't a crackling campfire but a jet engine of air and fuel igniting together. His father's boat, the Morning Star, went up in a column of flame taller than the mast itself, 1,000 hours of restoration collapsing in seconds. Heat slapped him across the face. Fiberglass sagged like wax. The rigging snapped with rifle crack reports and fell into the water, hissing like serpents. Neighbors began spilling out of their houses, drawn by the light, their silhouettes framed by smartphone screens. Someone shouted for 911. Another tried to uncoil a garden hose, useless at this distance. Garrett could only stand there on the grass, his body a study in shock, the boat's reflection burning in his pupils. When the fire trucks finally arrived, sirens echoing off manicured cul-de-sacs, it was too late. The hull had already collapsed inward, sinking just enough to tilt and die. Firefighters in heavy coats stomped across charred planks, their boots leaving wet black prints, but the structure was beyond saving. A pale sunrise bled across the horizon, throwing the wreckage into merciless detail, a black skeleton in a mirror-flat lake. The fire marshal moved methodically, clipboard under one arm, collecting samples of melted resin, scraping up residue from the dockboard. Accelerant, he murmured to no one in particular. Gasoline. Point of origin stern deck. He didn't say the word out loud, but it hung in the smoke. Arson. Garrett retrieved the footage from the security cameras he'd installed only weeks earlier. 2 figures in hoodies climbed onto the boat at 2:37 a.m., one carrying a gas can. 30 seconds later, a dark sedan rolled away from the marina with its headlights off. The images were too grainy for faces, but not for intent. This wasn't vandalism. It was a message. Insurance could only offer a depreciated payout, a third of the boat's value, unless someone was arrested. On the HOA's private Facebook group, a post appeared by dawn. Tragic accident at the marina. Reminder: all residents must follow fire safety codes. Accident. As if gasoline poured from a can and lit in the night were a household mishap. By evening, the community had divided into silent factions. Some whispered sympathy. Others whispered theories, that Garrett had staged it for insurance, that he'd snapped. Donations on a GoFundMe page briefly hit 5 figures before being reported as fraudulent and frozen. Homeowners who'd supported him suddenly received violation notices for trivial infractions, a mailbox too short, a trash can visible from the street. Fear works fast. Garrett's daughter drove up unannounced and found him sitting on the edge of the dock, wrapped in a blanket someone had handed him, staring at the blackened water. She begged him to leave. For a moment he considered it, packing up, walking away. But under the workbench in his garage, he found his father's old Coast Guard manual, its leather cover worn smooth. On the inside cover, in faded handwriting, "Calm seas never made a skilled sailor." Grief hardened into something colder. If he couldn't yet prove who set the fire, he could prove something worse. He would strip power from the people who had tried to scare him off and show the entire neighborhood what they had really been paying for. Storm of voices, he knew the story wasn't over. The law still had to move, and Linda, cornered and humiliated, might still thrash before the end. The morning after the town hall felt like the calm that follows a hurricane. Social feeds lit up with clips of the meeting. Local TV ran the segment 3 times before lunch. View counts climbed into the hundreds of thousands. In every video Linda Drayton sat isolated at the back of the hall, eyes down, while Garrett's slides exposed line after line of fraud. Memes sprouted overnight. The illusion of an untouchable HOA president had shattered. Before noon the Attorney General's office moved from audit to action. Subpoenas for bank records and tax filings had already gone out, now warrants followed. SBI agents executed a search on Trey Drayton's car and recovered the gas can coated with accelerant. Text messages from his phone showed his mother directing him to handle the boat situation and make it look like an accident. Confronted with the evidence, Trey agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence. 2 days later, unmarked sedans rolled quietly into Emerald Bay Estates at dawn. Neighbors peeked from windows as agents in windbreakers walked up Linda's front step. She opened the door in a sweatshirt and yoga pants, mascara streaking down her cheek. The warrant listed felony embezzlement, fraud, tax evasion, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit arson. She was led down the walkway past the manicured hedges she had fined others for, her hands cuffed in front of her, while cameras clicked like hail on a tin roof. News outlets picked up the footage within hours. HOA president arrested on fraud and arson charges blared across screens from Raleigh to Charlotte. Comment sections overflowed with homeowners sharing their own HOA horror stories. Coldwell Banker terminated her franchise license. The bank moved to seize the Myrtle Beach condo purchased with HOA funds. Page's cooperation became public record, and Hank's testimony sealed the case. Meanwhile, the court appointed an interim manager to oversee the HOA's frozen accounts and schedule legitimate elections. Homeowners who had feared retaliation now stood on their porches waving at Garrett as he walked past. Marisol's landscaping truck received a free repaint from a grateful neighbor. The GoFundMe was reinstated and quadrupled in a week. The neighborhood, once ruled by selective enforcement, began to feel like a community again. Garrett didn't gloat. When he stood at the edge of his empty dock space watching the winter sun rise over the lake, he thought about the morning star and the smell of melted fiberglass. Justice didn't bring the boat back. But it had done something larger. It had stopped the cycle, exposed the hidden theft, and given 300 families a chance to rebuild trust in their own street. On sentencing day, months later, he sat quietly in the back of the courtroom. Linda entered in a county-issued jumpsuit, her once immaculate hair limp, her hands trembling. The judge read out the counts: felony embezzlement, fraud, tax evasion, conspiracy to commit arson. 7 to 10 years in state prison. Restitution ordered. Her son received 3 years with probation after. The gavel came down like a final wave hitting shore. Outside, reporters asked Garrett how it felt. He simply said, "Calm seas never made a skilled sailor," and walked away. At home, on a new pier under construction, he unfolded his father's Coast Guard manual and set it on a workbench beside a small model of the Morning Star he'd begun carving from teak. The lake was still. The neighborhood was quiet. And for the first time in a year, he felt the steady pull of the water without the undertow of fear. The story that had begun with a burning boat ended not with revenge but with accountability, a reminder to anyone who wields power in secret that even a single homeowner, armed with facts and persistence, can sink a corrupt machine.